For tonight, I have several archaeological and historical stories for you that will take us to the antiquity, Indiana Jones style, and give us a good entry point to learn about the periods they belong to. This journey will take us from Jerusalem, the Dead Sea and the Holy Land, to Babylon, to Persia, to the mountains of Ethiopia. I'll tell you about King Solomon, the Queen of Sheba, a fabulous lost treasure, and the mysterious order of assassins. We have so many things to discover tonight, so first let's get comfortable and light a fire before I tell you a little bit more about our upcoming stories. You can sit or lay down comfortably and let the sound of my voice guide you through this long journey into the past. Or let it play in the background as you do something else. In any case, you don't need visuals to follow the stories. Our first story, the Ark of the Covenant, will make us talk about the elaboration of the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, about ancient Jewish kingdoms, the rise of Babylon, and the destruction of the first temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. We will also follow legends and rumors about what happened to the Ark, if it ever existed historically. And this will take us as far as Ireland, France, the US, and Africa, especially the Kingdom of Ethiopia. Our second story, the Copper Scroll, that was discovered in the Judean Desert, will give us an opportunity to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls and put us on the trail of a fabulous treasure described on the scroll that was never retrieved, if it existed. And finally, we will move several centuries in the sands of time to discover the Order of Assassins, a mysterious sect that became famous in Syria and in Persia, where their strongholds, especially their capital Alamut, were located. Before we begin, don't forget that, as always, you can use the timestamps to navigate these long stories. They are pinned in the comment section, together with links to audio streaming platforms where you can also listen to my stories, like Spotify or Apple Music. And yet another possibility is on Patreon, where you can listen to them as a podcast, or easily download them so that you have audios and videos available offline. Now take a deep breath. Our journey is just beginning, and our first story is about the Ark of the Covenant. What is the Ark of the Covenant? And did it really exist? Was it just a symbol or a real historical artifact? And if it did exist, what happened to it because its trace was lost 25 centuries ago? The Ark of the Covenant is described or mentioned several times in the Bible, especially in its second book, the Book of Exodus. The Book of Exodus describes the deliverance of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, how they escaped, led by Moses, their leader, and received revelations and also a binding covenant with God. According to the biblical narrative, the Israelites arrived to a mountain in the desert out of Egypt that they were fleeing, Mount Sinai. They set camp at the foot of the mountain, and on the morning of the third day there were thunders and lightnings, and a thick cloud gathered above the mount. God came down upon Mount Sinai. Their leader Moses went up, and he returned with 2 stone tablets, the tablets of the covenant, that were covered with 10 commandments, written by the finger of God himself. These tablets were placed inside a chest that is precisely described. It would have been made of wood, 4 feet long, 2 feet high and wide, covered entirely in gold, with a molding of gold around it. And 4 rings of gold would have been placed to its 4 corners, and through these rings, 2 staves, 2 poles of wood for carrying the ark. On top, the chest would have been sealed with a golden lid covered with 2 cherubims, 2 angels, and still according to the biblical account, after its creation, the ark was carried by the Israelites during their wandering in the desert, which lasted for 40 years. When on the march, the ark was always hidden under a large veil, as it couldn't be seen by anyone, and it was carried ahead in advance of the people. Finally, after 40 years in the desert, they arrived to the Promised Land, still carrying the ark that was featured in a number of other episodes. For example, when the Israelites needed to cross the Jordan River. As soon as the priests who carried the ark touched the waters, the river grew dry, and this allowed everyone to cross safely. The ark also appeared in the Battle of Jericho. Jericho was a city that the Israelites fought. The story says that after the ark was carried around the walls of the city, these walls suddenly collapsed and Jericho could be taken easily. Several years later, the ark was taken to assist the Israelites in their war against the Philistines, a people they were at war with. But they lost the battle, and the ark was captured by their enemies. For 7 months, the Philistines suffered a number of plagues sent upon them for keeping the ark, until they returned it to the Israelites to stop the plagues. And after more tribulations, the ark was placed in Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, also known as the First Temple. At this point, it disappeared from biblical sources. But the temple, which would have been built in the 10th century BC, was destroyed in the 6th century BC by the Babylonians, and there is no trace of the ark in the accounts of this period or after. So this creates more questions than answers. First, was the ark real or just mythical? And if the ark actually existed, what did it become? So let's take a look at what archaeology and history can tell us about the Ark of the Covenant and the times when it supposedly existed. As you know, the Bible is a compilation, a collection of religious texts or scriptures that are sacred to Christians and Jews. They all consider the Bible to be inspired by God, but even though it is somewhat similar, the Bible is not exactly the same depending on religious groups or traditions. From one denomination to another, its content may vary. The Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, is approximately the first part of the Christian Bible under the name of Old Testament. Approximately because depending on Christian denominations, the Old Testament is not exactly the same. The order and the names of the different parts, the books, may change a little bit. The books and their orders included by each tradition in the Bible is called the Canon. For example, the Catholic Canon comprises 46 books in the Old Testament. Orthodox churches generally have 49, and the most common Protestant canon has 39. It is a bit shorter. These 39 books of the Protestant canon are common to all Christian denominations, and they are quite close to the Hebrew Bible, with just a few differences in order and text. The Tanakh, or the Old Testament, was elaborated over several centuries, and it is full of stories that recount the creation of the world, God's interactions with humans, the history of the Israelites, from their conquest of the promised land of Canaan to their defeat and exile in Babylon. We'll come back to this. Now, the vast majority of traditions and denominations within Judaism and Christianity consider that these books from the Old Testament should be taken as metaphors, as poetry that teaches the truth beyond the literal stories. And this view is shared by archaeologists, historians, or scientists. So, to them, the physical existence of the Ark of the Covenant is not such a crucial element. In any case, biblical texts are very ancient. We know from historical sources that in the 5th century BC, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, called Torah, which are also the first 5 books of the Old Testament, already had authoritative status among Jews. But how did these Hebrew texts pass to Christians? First, Hebrew texts were translated to Greek in Alexandria in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, when Alexandria was the capital of Egypt, which had a Greek dynasty after the fragmentation of the empire of Alexander the Great. And Alexandria was a major center of culture in the Mediterranean. In the 1st century AD, once Christianity had appeared, these same texts, these Greek translations, were used by converts to the new religion, and they became the basis of the Old Testament in the Eastern Orthodox Church. At the time, Greek dominated as the language of communication between peoples in the Eastern Roman Empire, in the east of the Mediterranean Sea. But in the West, it was Latin. At first, Bibles in the Western Roman Empire were a direct translation of these same Greek texts to Latin. This first Bible in Latin was called the Vetus Latina. Until the end of the 4th century AD, when the Pope in Rome commissioned a Latin Bible to replace the Vetus Latina, and this new Bible was translated directly from Hebrew, from original texts. It is called the Vulgate. The Old Testament from the Vulgate is the basis for the Standard Bible in the Roman Catholic canon, but more books that were not part of the Hebrew Bible were officially added to the Old Testament in the 4th and 5th centuries. They were among the ancient Hebrew texts translated to Greek in Alexandria, but they were not considered a part of Tanakh by Judaism. When the Reformation began, much later in the 16th century, one of its goals was to return to a canon seen as more authentic, to get rid of additions made over the centuries by the Roman Church, and another Christian Old Testament was formed that was limited to the Hebrew Bible, even though it still uses the order of books from the Greek Bible, from the Greek translation. As you also know, the Old Testament is just the first division of Christian Bibles. The second part is the New Testament, that is specific to Christians and discusses the teachings and person of Jesus, events from the 1st century AD. The New Testament is much more homogeneous. It has been universally recognized within Christianity since late antiquity. So it is the same between most Christian denominations. All the main differences are in the Old Testament. But whatever the version, all Bibles contain the book of Exodus that tells of the Ark, and they also contain various other mentions in following books. Is this enough to consider it real? Because even though a vast majority of scholars who studied biblical archaeology agree that some parts are mythical, such as the Book of Exodus, or the Garden of Eden, or Noah's Ark, it is also a fact that biblical texts speak of many real places and real people, not just in the New Testament, where the historicity of many characters is proven beyond doubt, starting with Jesus. Believing in his teachings as recounted in the Gospel is a matter of faith, but the existence of Jesus as a man who lived at the beginning of our era is attested by multiple documents and testimonies that are not religious. It is also believed that various characters from the Old Testament, such as King Solomon, are probably real, even though the accounts of their wealth or their power that are in the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament may be very embellished, because they don't really fit with our archaeological knowledge of these regions and these periods. So the existence of the Ark of the Covenant remains an interrogation point, since all original sources are biblical. But on the other hand, the Ark is mentioned repeatedly, and descriptions are very coherent in the Bible, and it is perfectly possible that such an ark was built, regardless of whether or not it had all the powers that were attributed to it. The description was precise enough for replicas to be made or painted. They all have similar measurements. They are golden, as written in the Bible, and with 2 angels on top of the lid. As I said before, the ark's trace disappeared once it was supposedly placed in the Temple of Jerusalem at the time of King Solomon, and that would be 3,000 years ago, in the 10th century BC. There is no longer any mention of it, but we know that in the 6th century BC, almost 400 years later, Jerusalem was captured by the Babylonians, and the Temple of Solomon destroyed. So if the ark was not destroyed with it, which is a possibility, it had to be removed somehow. And there have been a number of claims of having discovered or even having possession of the ark since then. So let's take a look at these various claims. The first one locates the ark in Egypt, and it seems it appeared just a century ago when the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun was discovered. This Egyptian-led Egyptian theory is the basis for the first Indiana Jones movie, in which the ark is not hidden inside Tutankhamun's tomb, it is kept in a lost ancient Egyptian city. The tomb of Tutankhamun was discovered in 1922 in the Valley of the Kings, which is near Luxor. In the 2nd millennium BC, this was where the capital of Egypt under the New Kingdom, Thebes, was located, and many pharaohs were buried in the Valley of the Kings. Tutankhamun was not a major figure in the history of ancient Egypt, but he is very famous because his tomb was discovered untouched, contrary to other royal tombs that had been looted over the centuries. His tomb remained sealed for more than 3,000 years. The mummy, all the treasures and offerings that had been placed with his body. This makes his tomb an extraordinary testimony of the rights of ancient Egyptians, of their art at the period of Tutankhamun's death, their beliefs, and also the wealth of pharaohs, because even though Tutankhamun died young and lived during a period of transition, he was still buried with a spectacular quantity of precious metals, artifacts, gems and works of art. So what is the relation with the Ark of the Covenant? In the tomb there was a processional ark called the Anubis Shrine, which was part of the burial equipment. As soon as the first photographs of the inside of the tomb were published, some claimed that the Anubis Shrine was the Ark of the Covenant that had stayed hidden for centuries. Its shape and the presence of 2 poles to carry it sort of matched the biblical description. Now this idea was quickly discounted for several reasons. First, because the dimensions are different. The Anubis Shrine is smaller and doesn't have the shape of a rectangular chest. Second, because there is a figure of Anubis on top of the artifact, not angels. And on top of this, the timelines don't correspond. The tomb of Tutankhamun was closed almost 400 years before King Solomon supposedly placed the ark in the Temple of Jerusalem, if we believe the biblical accounts. So this is not a credible hypothesis. But there may be something interesting in the general similarity between this Egyptian artifact and the description of the ark. The description of the chest in the Bible doesn't appear random. In the 2nd millennium BC, at the time when the events of the Exodus would have happened, ancient Egyptians made this type of portable chests supported by 2 poles that were used as shrines or placed under the feet of statues of gods. So this gives circumstantial support to the theory of the ark as a real object, because indeed its shape and its function correspond to existing artifacts of the time in the region. Another possibility would be that the Babylonians took the ark to Babylon, even though this is not supported by any known document or testimony. The city of Babylon was at the heart of a cultural area in Mesopotamia for centuries, and a beacon of civilization in the Middle East for a long time in the second and first millennia BC. It had a long history with several dynasties and periods of expansion or decay. Its last peak period was in the 7th and 6th centuries BC, during a period called the Neo-Babylonian Empire. At the time, Egypt had declined and would never recover its past splendor, and the Babylonians were the great power of the region. They expanded their empire to all of Mesopotamia and more regions of the Middle East that correspond to Syria, Jordan, Palestine, a part of the Arabian Desert. But they also faced a series of rebellions in the western part of this empire, in the Levant. Several peoples who were vassals or occupied by Babylon, like the Phoenicians, the Arameans, and the Israelites, revolted. In the 7th century, the Levant had been under control of the Assyrian Empire, and there were two Jewish vassal kingdoms, the Kingdom of Israel and the smaller Kingdom of Judah, which had Jerusalem as its capital. But at the end of the 7th century BC, the Assyrians were defeated, and a competition ensued between Babylon and Egypt to control the eastern Mediterranean. The Kingdom of Judah had been turned into a vassal state by the Babylonians, but after a few years it refused to keep paying tribute and was punished for this. Jerusalem was besieged, and after the fall of the city, the temple where the ark would have been placed was destroyed, and a number of people from the Kingdom of Judah were deported to Babylon. It is believed they were members of the elite of this kingdom. Archaeology confirms that at the time Jerusalem was mostly destroyed, and if the ark was still there, it could have been taken by the Babylonians to Mesopotamia and maybe travel even further east later. Because a few decades after these events, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was vanquished and annexed by the Persians. This is entirely speculative, but if the ark existed, it could have been taken somewhere in modern Iraq or Iran, unless the ark could be hidden shortly before the arrival of the Babylonians to Jerusalem. There are Hebrew texts translated to Greek that point to the ark being hidden shortly before the siege of Jerusalem. It would have been hidden at Mount Nebo, which is an elevated ridge, a small mountain, that is located in Jordan today. But nothing was ever found there that we know of. Yet other claims locate the ark in Europe or even in America. They are also not technically impossible, but they are not substantiated by a lot of credible evidence. One is that the ark was taken to Rome by early Christians and placed in a basilica where it burned. This is based on the account of a rabbi from the 2nd century who claimed he saw the lid of the ark in Rome. Another claim located the ark in Ireland at the end of the 19th century, hidden at the Hill of Tara. The Hill of Tara is a site of great archaeological significance in Ireland. It used to be an ancient ceremonial site. It consists of numerous monuments and earthworks that date from the Neolithic to the Iron Age. Traditions and mythology make it the place where ancient high kings of Ireland were inaugurated. and the theory that the ark was at Tara was really colorful. In the 19th century, there was a society in Great Britain called the British Israel Association. They followed a set of beliefs called British Israelism. Its members were convinced that the Anglo-Saxons were descended from the lost tribes of Israel. Few people took them seriously back then, and they had many other beliefs that seemed to come out of nowhere and were already contradicted by the archaeological knowledge of the time. But they convinced themselves that the Ark of the Covenant had been brought to Ireland and buried at Tara. So between 1899 and 1902, at a time when Ireland was not independent from the UK yet, which made the matter very sensitive, they came from England and began excavations at the site looking for the ark without any piece of historical evidence to show other than their certainties. They were finally stopped before they damaged the site. Yet other claims locate the ark in France, one of them in a village in the south of France, where it would have stayed for centuries until it was moved to the United States at the outbreak of the First World War to protect it. This is the kind of claims that also inspired bits of Indiana Jones movies, where there's a warehouse full of ancient artifacts kept by the US government. Or, still in France, it would have been taken by the Knights Templar and hidden at the Cathedral of Chartres, which indeed has a representation of the ark that follows the biblical description. So the ark would have been brought by the Knights Templar, and again this is not technically impossible. The Knights Templar at the times of the Crusades had direct access to places in the Levant, including Jerusalem, where they could have found the ark and they could have taken it to Europe. They had a presence in many countries, and they were an international organization, an international order, but their main centers were in France, and this is probably where they would have brought the ark. But this is completely hypothetical. There is no document, no evidence that substantiates this claim. There is yet another trail that locates the ark in Africa, especially in Ethiopia. And even though it is also highly speculative, the Ethiopian possibility is a bit more solid. The predecessor state to modern Ethiopia was the Ethiopian or Abyssinian Empire, which was established in the 13th century, and it lasted until 1974, with a short period in the 20th century when it was colonized by Italy. But otherwise, Ethiopia resisted European colonization, and it developed for centuries a very original culture. It was one of the first regions in the world to officially adopt Christianity before the Roman Empire. In the 1st century AD, when Christianity began its expansion, the predecessor of the Ethiopian Empire already existed, the kingdom of Aksum, which was in the north of modern Ethiopia. Aksum existed for 10 centuries, and it prospered at the time of the Roman Empire because its land was more fertile than today, and it was well placed to benefit from ancient trade routes between India and the Mediterranean. It had access at the same time to the Red Sea and to the Nile River, so it could organize the transport of precious goods to the north and sell its own products like incense and ivory. The kingdom of Aksum converted to Christianity but because it was cut for a long time from other regions dominated by Christianity, Ethiopian churches follow their specific rites and traditions. They are often close to the Egyptian Coptic denomination. And the largest and also oldest Christian denomination in Ethiopia nowadays, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, claims that it possesses the Ark of the Covenant, and that the Ark is kept in Aksum, which has lost its ancient importance as a capital and is now a town in northern Ethiopia. But why would the Ark have traveled to Ethiopia? This is explained in a national epic, a text that is at least 700 years old, from the beginning of the Ethiopian Empire in the Middle Ages. This empire was created by a dynasty called the Solomonic dynasty, because they claimed that they descended from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. This brings us to the Antiquity and the Hebrew Bible again. The Queen of Sheba is a figure that appears in the Bible, and in the original story, she brings a caravan of precious gifts for the Israelite King Solomon. So this episode would have happened in the 10th century BC. And once again, this narrative may have roots in reality. Modern historians tend to identify Sheba with a kingdom that existed in the south of the Arabian Peninsula, the kingdom of Saba, that dominated what is now Yemen in pre-Islamic times. But this is not entirely sure, and the region that served as an inspiration for Sheba could have been on the other side of the Red Sea, in the Horn of Africa. In any case, even though the historicity of the queen is disputed, she has become the subject of different cycles of legends in the Jewish, Islamic, and Ethiopian traditions. In the Ethiopian tradition, and this is a narrative the Solomonic dynasty defended from the Middle Ages to the end of the 20th century, Solomon and the Queen of Sheba had a son, Menelik, the founder of the dynasty. Menelik grew up in Ethiopia, but later returned to visit his father, who reigned in the kingdom of Israel. And he returned with the ark, inspired by God to leave a forgery in the Temple of Jerusalem, to bring the ark to Ethiopia where it would remain safe. The ark finally arrived at Aksum after a journey through Egypt, where it would still be located today. The object is kept under guard in a treasury near a church in Aksum, and replicas of the ark are kept in every Ethiopian Orthodox church. Of course, this is all alleged, and no one can see the ark, which leaves the door open to speculation. The thing is that this narrative about the past of Ethiopia, which may not be historical but is very old anyway, it is at least from the 13th century. This story has become part of Ethiopian identity, and it is not in the interest of the church or of authorities to allow investigations and a datation of the ark. If it was proven to be more than 3,000 years old, it could be the artifact mentioned in the Bible, or at least an object from biblical times. But if it was less, the whole narrative about the past of Ethiopia would be challenged. So, as you see, the Ark of the Covenant keeps all its mysteries. We don't know whether it was real or mythical, and if it was real, what happened to it. But at least it gave us an opportunity to travel around the world and explore the past, so I hope you enjoyed this story. We're not done yet, and we're going to stay in the same region. Our second story for tonight is that of the Copper Scroll. Maybe you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because the Copper Scroll is one of them. Our story begins in 1946, near the Dead Sea, in an area that is mostly rocky desert. In a cave, Bedouin shepherds discovered old jars, and when they opened the jars, they found several visibly ancient scrolls written on parchment or papyrus. In the following years, the site attracted interest and was eventually methodically searched. A series of caves were discovered and thousands of written fragments. Some were well preserved, and a few scrolls were in good condition. Others had been damaged and had to be reassembled as much as possible to study them. In total, almost 1,000 manuscripts were reassembled. It appeared that most of these scrolls were written in Hebrew and a few others in Aramaic, which was a language of the same group spoken in the region. These scrolls were dated from the 3rd century BC to the 1st century AD. So they were stored in these caves over several generations, and the last ones were written when the region had become a province of the Roman Empire. For the most part, they are religious texts. There are copies of texts from the Hebrew scriptures, other religious texts that were not included in the Hebrew Bible. They were not canonized. You remember that the canon is the approved collection of texts that are seen as authoritative. They were not included in the Hebrew Bible, but some of them were in the Catholic or Orthodox canons. These texts were copies made or obtained by the people who stored them in the jars, and the remainder of the scrolls are also religious manuscripts, but they were unknown until then, and it appeared they were specific to the particular group who lived nearby. Judaism at the time was not unified. It still isn't. There were groups or sects that shared enough scriptures and beliefs to be part of Judaism, but also went by their specific set of rites of religious practices, and they formed communities. Actually, one of the scrolls details the ideals and rules of this particular community. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are an archaeological treasure because they are a first-hand testimony, more than 2,000 years later, of the culture, the rites, the preoccupations of the people who lived near the Dead Sea before and during the Roman Empire. But one of the scrolls differs significantly from the others. The other scrolls are written on parchment or papyrus. You know what papyrus is. Parchment is animal skin that is dried under tension. It was used as a support for writing several thousand years ago, and actually it remained used extensively until the end of the Middle Ages when paper replaced it. But this one scroll is made of copper. It is 8 feet long, and unlike the others, it is not a religious or literary document. Instead, it contains a list of places where treasures of gold and silver would be located. The list is impressive. There are 63 different locations, and the sum of their treasures would amount to several tons of precious metals. The scroll was dated to the 1st century AD. It is one of the last, maybe the very last one, to be hidden in the caves. And at the time, the Romans had taken possession of the region. So a possible theory is that the treasures were hidden from them. Several theories have actually appeared about this treasure. One is that it never existed, or that it disappeared because the Romans found it and took it. It is true that some of the locations could be identified, but no treasure hunter ever found anything following the indications from the scroll. Another theory is that the treasure was discovered by the Knights Templar. People really like to make theories about them, even with very little elements to support these theories. There would have been several copies of the same scroll, and the Knights Templar would have found one when they were in the Holy Land during the First Crusade, and they would have dug up the treasure and used it to fund their order, which indeed was very wealthy. These claims look more like a storyline for a novel or a movie, and they are unsubstantiated, so most scholars don't take them seriously. The theory that the Romans found the treasure and took it away may be more credible, because they had an active policy of retrieving treasures in the provinces they conquered. They could have interrogated captives, which was normal practice at the time for them. There is no record of the discovery of such a fabulous treasure in Roman archives, but this is not incompatible because it could have been stolen or lost or considered a tribute. And yet another theory that would explain the disappearance of the treasure would be that Jewish people retrieved it and used it to rebuild Jerusalem. The city had been besieged by the Romans and was very damaged after the siege, so they may have waited for the Roman army to leave and got back the treasure using the scroll or a copy. Once the conquest was over and the Romans were installing their administration. But if it existed, where did this treasure come from? It looks very unlikely that it belonged to the community that stored all the scrolls, because it is understood from their documents that they lived an ascetic lifestyle, with close to no material wealth. So another possibility would be that the treasure came from the Temple of Jerusalem. You remember that the first Temple of Jerusalem, the Temple of Solomon, was destroyed in the 6th century BC, when the Babylonians took the city. So it looks extremely unlikely that its treasure would be listed on a scroll created 600 years later. But the temple was rebuilt. A second temple replaced the first, and existed from the late 6th century BC to 70 AD. The Romans were faced with Jewish revolts in the 1st century, and as a retaliation, they destroyed the Second Temple. A remain of this Second Temple in the old city of Jerusalem is the Western Wall, or Wailing Wall. This wall was erected in the 1st century BC as a retaining wall for the Second Temple, which was being expanded. It has become a holy place in Judaism because of its proximity to the Second Temple, which no longer exists. The timelines seem to match quite well. The scroll was dated approximately from the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, or a bit later. But evidence that this treasure was from the temple lacks, and apparently the temple had not been emptied when the Romans took it. because they did send to Rome various items from it. These appear in Rome pictured on the Ark of Titus, the Roman emperor at the time. This ark was erected to commemorate the deification of Titus and his victory over the Jewish rebellion in Judea. So it doesn't fully work either, and this is why many specialists consider that either the treasure did not exist, or that it was retrieved long ago by the Romans, by the Jews, or by looters. But if it did exist, there are more than 60 different locations where it would have been hidden, so who knows? Some of them that haven't been identified may still wait for someone to discover a treasure that has been waiting for almost 2000 years. And now let's move on to our third story for tonight. And with this one we're going to stay in the Middle East, but a millennium later. Do you know where the word assassin comes from? It's Arabic originally, Ashishiyin or Ashashiyan in Persian, and it means hashish eaters. Hashish means herb, but it is also the name of the drug made with the resin of cannabis. And then the word passed to Italian and French as a synonym for murderer, and then to English in the 16th century. But Ashishiyin, assassin, was a derogatory name given by their opponents to an order who lived in the mountains of Persia and Syria at the time of the Crusades and until the Mongol invasion of the region. They created a state, and they held several strongholds, but they also used tactics of infiltration to assassinate their enemies or people standing in their way, and even kill individuals for a price when it could further their goals or help protect their state, which, as we're going to see, was constantly threatened. So don't believe their order was about drugs. On the opposite, it was very organized. They followed a discipline and a dedication to their cause that frightened their enemies. In this story, we are going to explore who were the assassins, where they came from, how they operated, and what happened to them. This order, or more precisely maybe this sect, appeared in the context of succession conflicts between Sunni and Shia Muslims. You know that there are two main branches of Islam. The biggest one in terms of number of believers is Sunni Islam, which is followed nowadays by more than 80% of the world's Muslims. The other is Shia Islam, which is present in many countries as a minority, but is particularly strong in Iran, where it dominates. This schism appeared relatively early in the history of Islam, in the 7th century, over a succession conflict. At the time, Islam was expanding very fast to the Middle East and North Africa, at the expense of an old Persian empire, the Sassanids, and of the Eastern Roman Empire of Byzantium. In a sense, this new empire was victim of its success. In 656, its leader, the Caliph Uthman, was assassinated by rebels. And Uthman had a strong legitimacy because he was a notable companion of Prophet Muhammad and also one of his son-in-law. After his death, a succession crisis erupted for reasons that were essentially political, not religious. And this is when two main branches of Islam appeared. Over time, they also diverged in terms of traditions and rites, and there were more schisms within Shia Islam in the following centuries. A major one happened in the 8th century, also over a succession crisis, and it gave birth to a branch of Shia Islam called Ismailism. With this political and religious infighting, the Muslim empire of the 7th century went into more and more fragmentation, with several states and dynasties that claimed to be the most legitimate successors to the first caliphs. And in the 10th century, Ismailism was the branch of Islam that dominated a state centered on North Africa and Egypt, the Fatimid Caliphate. At the same time, other large, powerful Muslim states included the Abbasids in the east, in Persia and large parts of Iraq, and the Umayyads in the west, in North Africa and Spain. But for these states that were the successors to the first caliphate, the worst was still to come. In the years 1000, an invasion coming from Central Asia by a Turkic dynasty called the Seljuqs hit the Middle East. They had converted to Sunni Islam, and they invaded Persia at the expense of the Abbasids, who kept a religious role but were stripped of their political power, and they pushed to the west in the 11th century at the expense of the Fatimids. Actually, the first crusade was targeted at this new Seljuk empire that had taken control of Jerusalem. At the time, many cities and provinces in the region, in the Levant, were nominally under control of the Seljuks, but in practice they were almost independent. And for a part, it helped a lot the Crusaders to conquer cities and create small states in the Levant and stay for decades, because they were not faced with a coordinated response. They launched their invasion at a time when the region was far from unified, and the Seljuks had a loose control over many of their possessions. It is in this context that the sect or the order of assassins was born. The Seljuks had quickly overwhelmed parts of the Middle East, and their main Muslim opponent was now the Fatimid Caliphate, centered on Egypt. A new political feud erupted within the Fatimid Caliphate, and yet again a split happened. Ismailism split, and a new branch of it called Nizari took its independence. Behind its leader, Hassan-i-Sabah, this new group, this new sect, fled to Persia and created a sort of state that didn't consist of a single piece of land, but was rather a nexus of strongholds throughout modern Iran and Syria. The most important one that can be considered their capital was the fortress of Alamut in the mountains south of the Caspian Sea. These fortresses, with small territories around, were surrounded by huge areas of hostile territory. As the Nizari had only enemies, the Seljuks in particular, but everyone was against them. They were seen as heretics by all other Muslims, and they were heavily outnumbered. So the need to survive in such a hostile environment shaped their organization and their mentalities. They couldn't afford open battles and conventional warfare, so instead they focused on the defense of their fortresses that could be defended with few men and were virtually impregnable or at a terrible human cost, and after a long siege. and they trained a select group of fighters called the Fedayeen, meaning those who sacrificed themselves. The order had many other ranks and functions. It was also a state, even though not in a conventional sense because its fortresses were scattered over a large area. But it is often remembered mainly for its assassinations. This is a bit unfair to the Nizari because they were not created as an order dedicated to infiltration and assassination. They excelled at it to survive, mainly. And with success because they survived for 166 years, surrounded with enemies who wished for their destruction. But they also developed a specific culture, a version of Islam that emphasized esotericism and a literary tradition. It was much more than a secret society of mercenaries, like they are often pictured, typically like in the Assassin's Creed video games that are partly inspired by them. This is a sensationalist picture of what they really were. But still, because they couldn't defeat armies, they targeted leaders, and many of their political adversaries were assassinated by Fedayeen. These murders were most of the time committed in public spaces to intimidate, and the assassins quickly became famous for them. At the time, this tactic of assassination was not limited to them. The Seljuqs and the Crusaders too used it, but their fame as killers was such that most of the time an assassination would be attributed to the order. Over several decades, they eliminated hundreds of people, almost always prominent figures like ministers, generals, governors, including one Seljuk vizier, an equivalent to a prime minister. But their order couldn't survive the wave of the Mongol invasion in the 13th century. If you are interested, I made a story about the Mongols. The Mongols overwhelmed the whole region where the Nizari had their fortresses, and one after the other, the strongholds fell. They lost Alamut in 1256, and in a few years the order was disorganized and dismantled. Ismailism, of which they were a part, still exists. It is a minority branch of Islam, but it still has millions of followers, especially in Pakistan and India. Maybe you've heard of the Aga Khan. The Aga Khan is the Imam, the leader of the Nizari Ismaili Shias. Their religious traditions and history are quite specific within the Muslim world, and they barely have a presence in the countries where the Nizari state had its fortresses, but their branch of Islam can be traced to the 11th century, when the Fatimid Caliphate saw this schism between Shia Muslims. So this is all for tonight, and as usual, I hope you enjoyed these stories. I'd be happy to talk to you soon with a new exploration journey. In the meantime, sleep well. Sweet dreams. Au revoir.